I used to believe love was nothing more than a door closing softly. No slam, no broken wood. Just the faint click of a lock you only notice after you've already walked away. For years I told myself that was fine. That my life was better in corridors, lined with schedules and predictable tasks, places where no windows opened and no wild weather could get in. Routine became my shield, silence my partner, loneliness my habit. And yet, the night that changed everything didn't ask for my permission, it arrived with rain. The kind of rain that rehearses all day and then performs with conviction, flooding streets until even the city admits it has no control. I left the office late, as usual, tie shoved into my pocket, eyes tired from reading words I didn't care about. I should have gone home. Instead, I walked along the old river lane, where the bricks echo back the rain in a deeper voice, like a cathedral whispering secrets to itself. Halfway down, there is a café that always looks closed, even when it isn't. Its door sticks like it's daring you to enter. I pulled, it resisted, then surrendered, and I stepped inside where the air smelled of cinnamon and tired milk, where the yellow light was so soft it made strangers look like memories. I ordered black coffee because I'd convinced myself that bitterness was honesty, and I sat at the fogged window where the rain wrote its alphabets on the glass. That's when I saw her. 3 tables away, not reading but turning pages slowly, like someone who wanted to remember the weight of paper. She wore a blue coat too thin for the weather, hair pulled back without apology, and a slim silver ring on her right hand instead of her left. Every few seconds she lifted her eyes, as if listening for something only she could hear. When our gazes finally caught, it wasn't a glance. It was a held moment, a nail hooking 2 sleeves together. I panicked and looked away, burned my tongue on coffee, then looked back. She was still there. A few minutes later she stood, walked toward me, and pointed at the empty chair across my table. "Is this taken?" she asked, and I nodded too quickly. "Please." She sat, setting her paperback between us like a passport, like evidence that she had traveled through other worlds before landing at mine. "I'm Lena," she said, her voice warm but tired, like someone who had been brave all day. "Adam," I replied, giving her my real name though it felt like handing over a secret. She looked at the rain outside and asked, "Are you watching it or waiting it out?" "Both," I said. She smiled, not at me but at the thought, and told me I was answering with the second most honest thing in my head. She wasn't wrong. Then she asked for something true. Not a polite fact, not a job title. Something that cost. I surprised myself by saying, "I'm afraid of birthdays." She tilted her head, studying me. "Because they count. Because they indict," I said. "Every year becomes a ledger. What I built, what I abandoned, who I disappointed. I don't want to live like an audit." She didn't laugh or pity me, just nodded once, as if acknowledging that fear is a kind of honesty. Then it was her turn. "I'm tired of explaining," she said softly. "Of starting with it as not what you think and ending with, I'm sorry you heard it that way." We sat with that silence, and it felt like a kind of trust. The barista placed a plate of cinnamon bread near the counter, its scent drifting toward us like a test. Lena caught me glancing and raised an eyebrow. "Split one?" she said. She ordered it, tore it precisely, and when she handed me my half, our fingers touched. It was almost nothing, then suddenly everything. Something subtle shifted in me, like a curtain moving in a locked room. We talked more. I admitted I used to write short stories, abandoned when failure became louder than love. She told me she worked at the city archives, handling other people's yesterdays because paper doesn't argue when you put it back. She leaned forward, looking at me as though she could hear the words I hadn't spoken yet. "You're holding a story hostage," she said. "You look like someone who refuses to tell the one story that might save him." Her certainty frightened me, but I also wanted to believe her. I almost confessed everything right there. The neat departures, the winter I left someone who loved me, the manuscript rotting in a drawer. Instead, I said, "It's not a story. It's just a list of apologies in tidy columns." She shook her head gently. "That's still a story. Just one that hasn't forgiven itself." And then, without transition, she said, "Come see something." She stood, and I followed, leaving our cups half finished. Outside, The rain had softened, but still insisted. She led me to the river, to the bridge with graffiti constellations, where the concrete hums from traffic above. She pointed at a photo glued to the wall. A girl on a bike, hair streaming, knees scarred, mouth open in a scream that was either joy or terror. "That's me," she said quietly. "My sister took it when we were 11. I didn't know she kept it. I don't know who put it here. I come back to check it's still real." The edges had begun to peel, water threatening to erase her proof. I almost touched it, then didn't. "It's evidence," I said. "That once you trusted gravity enough to race it." She crossed her arms, then let them fall. Everyone thinks the defining moment was the crash. But it was the hour before, when I decided not to wait for my father. I wanted impatience more than permission. The rest was gravity. She turned to me. "The real reason I sat with you wasn't because the café was crowded. You looked like a man keeping a story hostage, and sometimes if I sit close enough, the story negotiates with me instead." My chest ached, because she was right. I whispered the first sentence. I left someone who loved me, because the person they loved wasn't who I wanted to be. Lena didn't flinch. She just nodded, like bravery deserved credit for showing up. "You didn't leave gently," she said. "I left neatly," I admitted. "Which is worse?" She smiled sadly. "Neatness is a lie. It pretends there was no weather." We stood under the bridge, our coats brushing, and the river spoke below us like an old witness. She told me to come to the archive tomorrow. "There's a letter I want you to see." A woman wrote to a man she never met, addressed him as if the future had a mailing address. "It begins badly and ends honest. That's the right order." I said I didn't believe in futures. She answered, "That's fine. Maybe the future believes in you." She tore today's square from a pocket calendar, wrote her number on the back, and pressed it into my palm. We said goodbye badly, which is the only good kind, and I watched her disappear into the night until she became part of the weather. At home, I placed the calendar square under my lamp. Didn't touch the manuscript drawer. Didn't argue with old ghosts. Instead, I texted her, "Thank you for borrowing me from my life tonight." And then, almost against my will, "Tomorrow?" The dots appeared, rose, fell. Her reply, "Let's not call it tomorrow. Let's just say more rain." Morning tried to remind me of who I had been yesterday, laying a pale light across the floor and waiting for me to step back into the costume of my old self, but the memory of Lena sat on my desk in the form of a torn calendar square glowing like a coal that refused to die. All through the hours at the office, I felt like a ghost trying to occupy a body that had already moved on. By noon I was restless, by 2 I was rehearsing excuses, and by 3 I told a lie about an off-site meeting and let my feet take me toward the archive where she had asked me to come, my pulse aware of both the foolishness and necessity of this choice. The building greeted me with doors that carried the weight of history, and inside the air smelled of paper and patience, the kind of atmosphere that forgives ink for fading. I saw her before she saw me, hair looser than last night, coat unbuttoned, explaining to a couple how the curve of a single letter could reveal affection, and when her eyes finally found me, she finished her thought before turning, as if the past had rules but I was permitted anyway. "You came," she said simply, and I answered that I wasn't sure I would until I was already there, which felt like admitting that my body had chosen for me. She led me to a glass case where an old letter lay almost transparent, the words barely holding, and told me to read. The first line said, "To the man whose name I do not know, but whose future I refuse to leave lonely," and something inside me tightened like a rope pulled too fast. I whispered that the woman had written to a ghost, but Lena said perhaps writing gave the ghost a reason to exist, and I could not argue because I knew she was right. We moved together through the cases, reading confessions that had outlived their owners, until we came to an envelope still sealed with wax, and Lena told me they left some unopened because questions make a room more honest than answers do. When I asked what she would do if her name were on that wax, she stayed silent long enough for me to hear the beat of my own nervous breath, then said she would ask someone to open it with her so the future would not be something faced alone. I stood next to her close enough to feel the air shift between us, not touching but changed by the possibility of touching, and I realized that staying beside her felt less like daring and more like remembering how to breathe. When the staff dimmed the lights, signaling that reverence had to be rationed, she turned to me and said, "Soup?" As if it were the most natural continuation of centuries of letters. And I followed her out into streets still damp with yesterday's weather. The restaurant we found was small, steaming, honest. We sat with bowls between us, steam curling like another form of language. And we talked as though silence had become a luxury we couldn't afford. She told me about her father who kept a shoebox of receipts because paper made money feel real. About her sister who lived 3 time zones away but texted her like a neighbor knocking on the wall. About her mother's garden where lilacs bloomed in January because nature listened to her stubbornness. I told her about a friend who died too neatly whose absence still felt like a scolding. About my panic in grocery aisles where too many cereals accused me of choosing wrong. About the manuscript in my drawer pages that smelled of resentment more than courage. She didn't laugh, didn't pity, didn't interrupt. She listened, really listened, as if my words had weight and she was prepared to carry them. When she finally spoke, it was to ask what my manuscript wanted from me. I told her maybe it wanted me to fail in public so it could stop haunting me in private, and she nodded, thoughtfully, before saying perhaps it just needed a witness who wouldn't to turn it into a verdict. Then she told me she kept her own collection. Letters written to moments, not to people, unsent apologies to the past, permissions she forgot to give herself in time, gratitude to days that didn't realize they were saving her. She never mailed them because she didn't know where moments received their post. And I suggested maybe under bridges, and she laughed, not loudly but with recognition, and said probably. Then she asked me to say the first line of my hostage story to give it air, and I did. I left someone who loved me because the person they loved wasn't to the person I wanted to be. This time the sentence didn't crack in my throat. It stood upright in the room, and everything, bowls, steam, spoons, kept existing around it. And I felt strangely grateful for that ordinariness, the proof that honesty didn't destroy a place when you set it down. She didn't absolve, didn't condemn, she simply nodded, and asked whether I confused neatness with kindness, and I admitted. I did that. I folded my exits until they looked polite, even if they were cruel, and she said neatness was the costume fear wore when it wanted applause. We smiled at how true it sounded, at how much it hurt. Outside, a bus exhaled and left, and the city went on pretending not to notice us. And we sat there longer than Soup should allow. Later we walked to the stop where she would leave. We hovered in the space where a hug might have lived, then stepped back, both at once, as though restraint had been choreographed. She boarded, turned back, and tapped the window twice. On another face it would have been cliché, but on hers it felt like punctuation, the promise of more. I stood in the red glow of taillights until the bus curved away, then walked home by the bridge where her photograph still clung to the wall, weathered but refusing to surrender. I whispered to it, "Stay," as though I could negotiate with time. At home, I wrote 3 sentences and left them imperfect, proof that truth doesn't need polish. Then I texted her. Today felt like a page that didn't argue when we turned it. She replied, "I'm practicing staying without guarantees. Today counts." I lay on the couch after that, not promising, not demanding, simply letting hope sit in the room with me. And as I drifted into sleep, I realized that what we said instead of breathing had become, at least for now, the only way I knew how to stay alive. Evening folded itself around the city like a letter creasing in the hands of someone who had written too much already. And I walked through it carrying the weight of Lena S. words from the archive as if they had been stitched into my coat. The bus had taken her away but left me with a pulse too loud for ordinary tasks, so I cleaned things that were not dirty, opened, and closed drawers for the sound of them, shuffled books into orders I abandoned halfway through, all while the calendar square on my desk burned like a soft lantern. By 8, the silence of my apartment became unbearable, and I let the night push me back to the river, to the bridge where the photograph of her childhood still clung to the wall like a stubborn proof. The air smelled of damp iron and old stories. I stood there watching the picture, its corners curling, the paper thinner with every hour of rain, and I thought about how fragile memory is when it depends on glue and weather. I almost took out my phone to send her a photo of the photo to prove to her it still existed, but something in me wanted to leave the moment alone, to let it breathe without a witness. Then I heard footsteps behind me and expected a stranger, a jogger, a man with a dog, but It was her. She didn't look surprised to see me, which surprised me more than anything. She had been running. Her hair was windblown, her breath fast, her eyes shining as if the night itself had guided her here. "Let me guess," she said, catching her air. "You were in the neighborhood." I smiled, because the truth was worse. "I followed a thought," I said, "and it led me here." She came to stand beside me, her presence folding into mine with ease. "Sometimes I think of this place as a chapel," she said. "You don't need belief. Just quiet." So we stood together, the river speaking in its low voice, cars stitching their rhythm above us, the photograph of the girl on the bike trembling in the breeze like it remembered motion. I asked her what she had really crashed into that day, and she smiled without humor. "A parked car," she admitted, "but also my own certainty. I had been waiting for my father to teach me. He meant to." Life interrupted. So I pushed the bike up the hill and let gravity do the teaching. I wanted impatience more than permission. "The crash was just the cost." She paused, looking at the photograph as if it were both hers and not hers anymore. "Since then I've been practicing the art of throttling joy so it won't embarrass me." I knew that practice intimately, the way you know your own scars without looking. I asked how long she stayed scared. "Long enough to call it maturity," she said. "Then I found work that rewarded my precision and forgave my fear. I stayed." "The trick with staying is that it starts looking like devotion." She turned her face toward me, the streetlight cutting a pale gold line across her cheek. "The real reason I sat with you that night wasn't because the café was crowded. You looked like someone keeping a story hostage. And sometimes, if I sit close enough, the story tries to negotiate with me instead." My throat tightened, and the first sentence escaped again, steadier now. "A scar instead of a wound." I left someone who loved me because the person they loved wasn't the person I wanted to become. She didn't soften it, didn't make it smaller. She nodded as if bravery was its own reward. "You didn't leave gently," she said. "I left neatly," I replied. "Which is worse?" She smiled, a sad kind of agreement. "Neatness is a lie. It pretends there was no weather. We let silence sit with us, not as emptiness but as company, until the air between our shoulders shifted, and our coats brushed, and the contact was nothing, then not nothing, then something." I told her I was tired of auditing myself, of grading every version of who I was as if the score could decide my worth. She said rubrics were how we pretend to control the weather, and maybe she was right. Because standing there, I felt how much of my life I had wasted trying to keep storms in tidy boxes. She turned back to the river. "I think you're someone who wants witnesses, not judges," she said. "So am I." I carried those words like a key slipped into my pocket. We walked slowly back toward the city, neither of us in a hurry to return to rooms that would feel smaller without the other in them. The shuttered cinema stood quiet at the corner, its posters peeling, its windows blind. She stopped to look at them, her breath curling in the cold. "Do you ever think about all the endings that no one saw?" she asked. "The films that closed in empty theaters?" I told her I thought the endings happened anyway, even without audiences, maybe truer for having been ignored. She considered this, then turned to me with a courage that looked almost careless. "Do you want to know the thing I don't tell people on second nights?" I smiled, startled that she was calling it a second night, counting already. "Yes," I said. She lowered her voice. "I'm not good at staying. I'm excellent at beginnings. I throw glitter at them. But staying is where I've been clumsy." I didn't rush to mirror her confession with my own. I let it stand tall between us, the only monument in the street. Then I asked, "What do you need to stay?" "Not guarantees," she said immediately. "Those are paper, not vows. Those are costumes. I need curiosity that doesn't die after the first chapter. Someone who keeps asking what I mean, even after I've changed my mind." "I can ask," I said. She turned her eyes on me, soft but unflinching. "Can you listen when the answer takes the long way?" I breathed in the cold, the faint trace of cinnamon still on my fingers from the café. "I'm learning," I said. She nodded as if that verb was the only one that counted. We reached the café again, dark now, its bell silent, its windows blind. We stood on the sidewalk, caught in the ritual of goodbyes. The air felt rehearsed, like it had been waiting for us to edit it. She stepped a little closer, then stopped, and I could smell the rain rehearsing again in the distance, metallic and certain. "I'll see you at the archive tomorrow," I said, making the words carry more than they could hold. "At 4, she confirmed. "There's a letter I want you to read. It begins badly and ends honest." "That's the right order." She tapped my wrist with one finger, a punctuation mark more than a touch. "If you change your mind, I'll tell you," I promised. She smiled at that, a quick surrender. "Thank you. I'm trying to build a life where people don't vanish just because they re-scared. I'm tired of rehearsing disappearances," I said. "Then let's practice staying in small pieces," she whispered. Soup, letters, rain. And then she turned, walked 3 steps, paused as if remembering something, and said without looking back, "Even bad stories deserve an audience. Sometimes they're just good stories with stage fright." Then she was gone, swallowed by the street's soft crowd. I stood there long after, the night performing its ordinary play around me, until I finally moved, past the bridge one more time, where the girl on the bike seemed to breathe with the wind. I told her softly, "We're trying again." The river made no objection. At home, I didn't open the drawer. I didn't need to fight the manuscript. I wrote 3 sentences and let them stand imperfect, mails left visible in the house of truth. Then I lay in the dark, phone in hand, and texted her without rehearsing. "I don't know how to do this well, but I can do it honestly." The dots rose, fell, returned. "Honestly is well enough," she replied. I placed the phone face down on the desk, closed my eyes, and for the first time in years, the silence inside me felt less like a prison and more like a room preparing for guests. Morning didn't exactly arrive. It gathered, like a slow decision at the edges of the sky, cautious and deliberate, waiting for me to step into it. I moved through the hours like a hinge without a door, trying to look employed, answering emails with the efficiency of someone reading lines for a play he no longer believed in. But all the while, the thought of Lena tugged at me, her promise of a letter that began badly and ended honest echoing under my ribs. By 3 o'clock, I had stopped pretending. I walked through a city rehearsing rain, the sky gray as an unopened envelope, and found myself once again pushing through the archive's heavy doors. Inside, the air had its familiar hush, a silence cultivated to protect ink and time. I saw her before she saw me. Sleeves rolled above her wrists, hair pulled back in a way that said she had work to do, but didn't mind interruptions. She noticed me a moment later and smiled small, steady, the kind of smile that isn't a performance, just a registration. "You are here. Ready?" she asked, and I surprised myself by answering, "Yes," with no hesitation. She led me to a glass case I hadn't seen before. The letter inside leaned slightly crooked, like it resisted even history's attempts to straighten it. "Read," she whispered, stepping back, and so I did. The handwriting was careful but trembling. "I write to you with hands that shook yesterday. I write because silence grew teeth." The words spilled into confession. A train not boarded, a door closed too softly. The excuses that sounded sensible until they became ruin. But then came the sentence Lena had spoken of. "I cannot correct what I did as the person I was, but I can love what I have not met with the courage I refused myself." The air thickened in my throat. I looked up at Lena and she was already nodding. "She didn't ask to be forgiven," I said. "She refused the math," she replied. "She chose inventory over ledger." We lingered, schoolchildren passing behind us with the half-seriousness of kids being taught reverence. One asked why the letters were locked in glass, and the teacher said, "So they don't run away." Lena smiled faintly. "We trap what we're afraid to honor." We moved together through the room, stopping before a sealed envelope. The wax glowed like a kept secret. "We don't open them all," Lena explained. "Some silences deserve to stand." I asked what she would do if her name was inside, and she took so long to answer I could hear my own uneven breath. Finally, she said, "I'd ask someone to open it with me, so the future wouldn't arrive alone." Outside, rain had finally committed. steady and unremarkable, but insistent enough to push us beneath a shallow awning. We stood close, not for intimacy but for shelter, and yet intimacy came anyway. "Walk or wait?" she asked. "Walk," I said, because waiting felt like hiding. So we walked the long way, and our conversation flowed in the strange rhythm. I was starting to trust questions that arrived unannounced. Truths spoken badly but still true. I told her I had received a message that morning from the person I left, polite and unaccusing, just a bruise disguised as courtesy. I admitted how reading it felt like pressing on a broken tooth, how my shoulders climbed to my ears as if they could block sound. She didn't ask to see it. She asked how my body felt when I read it. I described the chill under my sternum, the shallow breath. She said softly, "Your body keeps the archive you don't catalog. Maybe trust its filing system." In return, she told me about a love she stayed in too long, a person who offered tenderness but no curiosity. How care without wonder eventually became management, how she had lived like an intern in her own life. "I'm good at doing well," she said. I wanted to learn how to be good. Her words stayed with me like ink refusing to fade. By the time we reached the bridge, the photograph of her as a girl on a bicycle had thinned, its corners losing their argument with weather. She touched the wall just beneath it. "When it's gone, will you still come?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "The memory will have to glue itself. I want to witness whether it can." Later, in the café where the bell still rang like a tired guardian, we sat at the same table, and the barista asked if we wanted the usual. Lena shook her head and said, "Let's be slightly braver." So we ordered something new, something with cardamom and heat, and split a pastry that flaked like trust in careful hands. I told her I had written 3 sentences and not erased them. She celebrated quietly, with a small whistle. A knuckle tapped on the table, as though she had witnessed me carry a candle across a windy yard. She admitted she had written to her future self and, for once, hadn't apologized in it. We laughed, startled by how miraculous that felt. When my phone buzzed, the past knocking at today's table, I didn't hide it. I showed her the unopened message. "You don't owe me the narration," she said. "But if you want to practice telling the truth badly, I'll listen." So I told her badly, that I was afraid of answering because I didn't, to trust myself not to perform compassion as penance, that I was equally afraid of silence because neatness would celebrate, and somewhere in between there lived the human thing I didn't yet know how to do. She listened, coastline to waves. "Try a sentence that doesn't fix," she said. "Just acknowledge receipt." So I wrote, "Thank you for reaching out. I'm still learning how to speak about that time without pretending. I hope you're well." I pressed send, placed the phone face down, and found my lungs again. We finished the pastry, brave with cardamom, and when evening arrived, folding itself around us, we walked to the bus stop. I joked, half serious, "Walk me to the bus and tap the window?" "Only if you promise to do the same," she said, which I understood to mean she believed in turns, in departures that could be named instead of disguised. The bus arrived with its heavy sigh, and she boarded, turned, and tapped twice, her small sacrament. I tapped the air back, and as she disappeared into the city's bloodstream, I realized I was carrying that sentence from the old letter inside me now. The one about courage, the one about loving what you have not met. It was becoming my grammar. And for the first time in years, tomorrow didn't feel like an accusation. It felt like more rain. The day carried itself like a secret, heavy but humming, as if every hour knew something I didn't. I moved through the morning performing the old routines: coffee, emails, meetings spoken like lines I had no desire to remember, but beneath it all, the thought of Lena pulled at me like a current I had already surrendered to. By late afternoon, my body was restless, impatient, as though it had signed a contract my mind still hesitated to read. When I pushed through the archive doors, I found her there as though she had always been waiting. Sleeves rolled, hair loose, her presence steady as the pages she guarded. She smiled the kind of smile that doesn't congratulate you for arriving. It just acknowledges, "You're here and that is enough." We walked the rooms again, quietly this time, no need to narrate. She showed me a crooked letter from a man who couldn't to spell, but still knew how to love. And I showed her the tremor in my hand when I touched the glass. She asked if I had written more, and I told her I had 3 sentences, left imperfect on purpose. She didn't clap or praise. She simply nodded as if acknowledging a soldier who had survived a skirmish, and somehow that meant more. By the time the staff dimmed the lights, I felt dizzy with the realization that staying was becoming a practice, a form of bravery I had never mastered before. We left into rain that was steady but kind, the kind that rinses instead of performing. Lena suggested soup, and I said yes, because some repetitions are really rituals, and rituals are how we teach our hearts to trust. The restaurant we chose was quiet, bowls steaming between us, broth thick with garlic and memory. We talked about small things, her habit of alphabetizing spices, my drawer full of ticket stubs from films. I barely remembered, and yet every small admission felt like a hinge opening to something larger. She asked me suddenly what I feared most, and the old answers came like soldier's failure, exposure, being unlovable, but I surprised myself by saying, "That neatness will trick me again into thinking I lived." She reached across the table, fingers brushing my wrist where she had tapped before, and said, "Then let's practice the opposite of neatness." After dinner we walked in silence, letting the city fold itself around us. When we reached her bus stop, she turned with a smile that was both invitation and test. "Tomorrow?" she asked. My chest tightened, because the word tomorrow had always been dangerous to me, full of promises I never kept. I took a breath and gave her back the words she once gave me. "Let's not call it tomorrow," I said softly. "Let's just say, more rain." She laughed then, a low certain sound that felt like the world approving. The bus arrived with its heavy sigh. She stepped on, turned back, and tapped the window twice. And I tapped the air back, no longer embarrassed by the ritual, no longer afraid of the silly grammar we were inventing together. When the bus pulled away and her face disappeared into the night, I stood alone under the glow of a streetlight and realized something I had been denying for years. Love wasn't a door that shut or opened, not a ledger of what I built or abandoned. Love was weather. It came whether you deserved it or not. It rained when it wanted, sometimes violent, sometimes soft, sometimes inconvenient, but always real, always larger than control. I walked home with rain pressing against my shoulders, opened my apartment door, and for the first time in years, the silence inside didn't accuse me. It didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a room preparing for company.